Hey there, dreamers. Welcome to our channel. Tonight we turn the pages of a tale tucked beneath the chaos of inventions and innators, nestled in the quiet corridors of an organization most never knew existed. While the children of Danville build the impossible, and a platypus lives a double life, a man watches from the sidelines, steady, calm, and mustachioed. But before we drift into the classic journey of Major Francis Monogram from Phineas and Ferb, I would love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide our sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up. Let's begin the story of a man whose name might be played for laughs, but whose voice brings order to a world filled with nonsense. In a realm of agents and villains, of platypuses in hats and teenage angst, bundled in lab coats, someone has to be the steady hand, the stern eye, the barking voice of structure. That someone is Major Monogram, head of OWCA, the organization without a cool acronym. A place where animal agents are trained, missions are dispatched, and sometimes coffee is forgotten on the counter. But before the innators rise, and before the heroic battles unfold, Major Monogram begins his day the same way, early, upright, and already thinking 10 steps ahead. His uniform is pressed, his mustache combed to quiet perfection. He reviews Agent P's overnight mission logs, checks on the surveillance feeds, and prepares the morning briefing with the precision of someone who has long since abandoned the luxury of sleep. To the outside world, he might seem cartoonish, exaggerated, his voice too loud, his expressions too stiff. But in the sleepy corners of his life, beneath the perfectly tied tie and rehearsed cadence, lives a man of deep responsibility, a man who chose order when the world chose chaos. Every morning he steps into the briefing room. There's a chair, a coffee mug that reads, "World's OWCAist Boss," and a flat-screen monitor that connects him to the agents under his command. But above all that, there's something else. Silence. The kind of silence that wraps itself around routine. It is both comfort and cage. Major Monogram has always lived by routine, not because he must, but because routine is safe, predictable, clean. He leans forward, pressing the button to summon Carl, his ever-loyal intern. Carl arrives, not always on time, not always prepared, but always with enthusiasm. And though the Major's sighs may echo with exhaustion, there's an unspoken bond between them, one shaped by years of working side by side, by near misses, absurd villains, and the strange family they've become to one another. Major Monogram clears his throat. The camera blinks red. He's on. "Good morning, Agent P," he begins, voice steady and deep, just like every day before. It's more than a greeting. It's a signal, a starting pistol, for another wild, unpredictable day that he'll keep in check from behind the screen. But today is just like the last, and the one before that, and the one before that, and still, he shows up. There's a quiet dignity in that. Behind him, the walls of OWCA headquarters are sterile, gray, minimal. His office is functional, not flashy. On the shelf sits a photo frame, faced away from the camera, almost as though it's not meant to be noticed. Inside it is a picture from many years ago. A younger Monogram, smiling, genuinely smiling, alongside another man with kind eyes. His brother, perhaps, a friend. The frame offers no answers. He never speaks of it. Carl has never asked. And that's how the Major prefers it. He is a man of barriers. Barriers between work and personal life. Between emotion and duty. Between himself and the absurdity of the world around him. The platypus, the villains, the floating baby heads in the sky. It's all real, but none of it breaks his composure. He has trained himself to weather it all. That's what commanders do. But command comes at a cost. Once long ago, before he was a major, before OWCA, he had other dreams. Not all of them serious, not all of them in khaki. He'd wanted to be a singer, or was it a park ranger? The memory is faint now, faded beneath layers of reports, daily briefings, and performance evaluations. But sometimes, on quiet nights, the thought of a guitar string or a wilderness trail will brush past his mind like a breeze through an open window. And then it's gone. Because there's always another agent to brief, another crisis to handle, another innator to catalog, another platypus to guide. So he puts on the headset. He reviews the schematics. He reminds Carl again to label the coffee filters properly, and he continues the work of holding it all together. To the agents in the field, Major Monogram is the rock, the ever-present voice that calls them to action. But to himself, in the moments between the commands, the reports, and the screens, he's just a man. One trying to do the right thing, one trying to maintain order in a world that refuses to sit still. Because someone has to. And so in the dimly lit control room with only the soft humming of machines and Carl's occasional humming of Broadway tunes as background noise, the major sits, shoulders squared, back straight, a mustache proud. A commander, a protector, a quiet soul beneath a loud voice. But even the strongest voices grow weary with time. There are days when his commands feel like echoes bouncing off the metal walls. He speaks into the screen, but sometimes he wonders, does anyone truly hear him? Not just the words, but the weight behind them. The sleepless nights, the careful planning, the invisible web of responsibilities stretched tight across the walls of OWCA. Carl, as always, provides color to the gray. With his endless optimism and oddly specific hobbies, like knitting sweaters for aquatic mammals or designing unreasonably long PowerPoint presentations, he fills the room with a kind of warmth the major pretends not to notice. But he does, quietly, gratefully. Their banter, so often mistaken for irritation, is more like a well-rehearsed song. Carl forgets the coffee order again. The major sighs, groans a little, offers a sharp word, but there's no real sting behind it. It's ritual, it's companionship, however awkwardly expressed. Somewhere between the sarcasm and structure, there is care. On his desk, a file folder marked Agent P Historical Activity sits open. Hundreds of pages documenting each mission, each encounter with Doofenshmirtz, each narrowly averted disaster. He doesn't have to review them. He's memorized most of it. But still, he leafs through them, page by page, reminding himself of the trust he's placed in that small, silent agent. He often thinks about Perry, about how little they've ever spoken, yet how deeply he depends on him. A creature of instinct and loyalty. A quiet operator in a noisy world. They're not so different, he sometimes thinks. Both carry the weight of unspoken burdens. Both hide behind roles, one with a fedora, the other with a decorated rank. And yet Monogram knows that Perry will never fully understand what he sacrificed. The late nights, the missed birthdays, the quiet decision to remain single, to avoid the entanglements of a personal life that might distract from his post. Love had come knocking once or twice, but it always arrived in the form of soft distractions, a lunch missed, a call unanswered, a letter left unopened in the drawer beneath the stapler he never uses. There's no regret in his face, but there is something unfinished, something paused and never resumed. The major's apartment is clean, sterile, a mirror of his office, a bed rarely used except for the few hours he allows himself after the day's final check-ins. No family photos line the walls. No souvenirs from vacations, because there are no vacations. He says he doesn't need them. Says he prefers to stay close to headquarters. But Carl once found an unused ticket to a tropical island in the trash. No date, no explanation. Just the quiet discarding of a possibility. He walks the halls of OWCA late at night, long after Carl has gone home and the animal agents are back in their enclosures. The lights are dimmed, the silence vast. His footsteps echo against the tiles. There's comfort in the solitude, in knowing that, for now, all is still. All is safe. Sometimes he stops outside the window of the training facility, watches the rookies, a squirrel learning to throw tiny darts, a raccoon working on espionage skills. He smiles faintly. They'll be great someday. Some already are. He remembers being young once, eager, hopeful. His own training wasn't nearly as well organized. OWCA was smaller back then, less formal. But even then, he was drawn to the idea of order, of protecting something greater than himself. His old mentor, a name he rarely speaks, had once told him, "Francis, someday you'll carry the whole weight of this place. Not because you want to, but because no one else can." And so he does. Every report signed, every mission dispatched, every silly little form filed, all his doing. And he never asks for thanks. He just wants to know the world is still turning because of it. There is something deeply admirable about that. Something deeply lonely, too. As dawn begins to stretch its soft fingers across the skyline, Major Monogram returns to his office. Another day begins. Another mission awaits. Carl arrives moments later with 2 mugs of coffee, only one of them the correct order. The major raises an eyebrow but says nothing. He simply takes the wrong coffee, sips it, and sighs. "Let's get started," he says. And the voice of order echoes once more into the day. There's a kind of poetry to his life, though he'd never call it that. To Major Monogram, poetry is for retirement homes and romantic comedy films he pretends not to enjoy. But in truth, his world is built on rhythm. The same halls, the same briefings, the same steady voice ringing out into the unknown. And yet, despite the repetition, there's always something new waiting. A new invention from Doofenshmirtz, poorly conceived and hilariously named. A new report from Perry, filled with neat efficiency and quiet valor. A new mistake from Carl, usually involving office supplies or a laser printer mishap. These small details, these little interruptions, form the variations in his symphony of routine. And he notices them all, even if he doesn't say much. Like how Carl hums louder when he's nervous, or how Perry's missions take a few minutes longer when he passes by a certain park, or how the coffee machine seems to work better on Wednesdays for no logical reason. These aren't facts listed in reports. They're observations, details only someone who truly watches, truly cares would remember. For all his stiffness and structure, Major Monogram is, at his core, deeply attentive. Not just to the protocols and procedures, but to the people and creatures around him. And in a place like OWCA, where the extraordinary is ordinary, that quiet attention is what keeps everything balanced. He'd been offered promotions, positions at other agencies, even a chance to retire early and consult on defense strategy for larger organizations. But he declined them all, not because he wasn't tempted, but because leaving meant letting go, letting someone else take the helm of the ship he steered for so long. And he can't do that. Not yet. Because in his heart, OWCA isn't just a job. It's his purpose, his anchor, his reason to get up every morning and put on the same uniform, adjust the same tie, and straighten the same mustache in the mirror. He doesn't say it out loud, never has, but this organization, this strange, wonderful, ridiculous agency is his home. And the agents, interns, and platypuses who fill it, they're his family. Even Doofenshmirtz in some odd way. He reads every incident report that comes in. Even the minor ones, especially the minor ones. He marks the dates when agents take personal leave. He remembers birthdays, even if he never throws a party. And when an agent retires, he writes a personal note, even if they're a duck or a badger or a chinchilla with a badge. Because he knows what it means to serve quietly, to give years of your life to something that may never fully thank you. And he honors that. He holds tightly to the values instilled in him when he first put on the uniform. Discipline, honor, responsibility. But with time, he's added his own values. Patience, empathy, kindness hidden behind a deadpan stare. The world outside OWCA spins wildly. Children fly rockets out of cardboard boxes. Evil scientists make toast disintegrators for petty revenge. A summer day can stretch endlessly into the realm of the impossible. But inside this agency, there is one constant. Major Monogram. The voice, the mind. The steady presence that tells everyone, we've got this under control. And on the rare days when things do fall apart, when agents go missing or missions go sideways, he's the one who stays up through the night. Watching, coordinating, hoping, even praying perhaps, though he'd never admit it. He doesn't believe in giving up, not on agents, not on missions, and certainly not on the young platypus who's come to mean far more to him than a name on a file. Agent P, he often says, we're counting on you, and he means it. Because in a world full of wild machines and even wilder dreams, there's only one way to keep the balance. Trust, duty, and a voice steady enough to cut through the noise. That voice is his. Always has been. And as long as OWCA stands, as long as agents need guidance and coffee machines need scolding, that voice will remain unwavering, dependable, quietly brave. Outside the agency walls, no statues bear his name. No city plaques thank him for his service. The world at large doesn't even know he exists. To most people, the biggest threat on a summer day is melting ice cream. Not a rogue shrink ray or a rogue scientist with a tragic backstory and a new innator. But Major Monogram doesn't serve for applause. He never has. His fulfillment isn't found in medals or speeches. It's found in knowing that because of his work, others get to live their lives untouched by the chaos. To him, that's enough. He's watched agents grow from clumsy recruits into silent legends. He's seen interns blossom into dependable leaders. He's witnessed more odd inventions than most people can imagine, and he's given exactly one approving nod to each of them. It might seem like nothing, but from Major Monogram, a nod means everything. His praise is rare, but when it comes, it's real. Carl, despite all his quirks, understands this. He sees what others might miss, that the sternness is a shell, that the barking voice masks a man who feels deeply, who worries, who cares far more than he lets on. Sometimes late at night, Carl will stay back just a little longer, pretending he forgot to file a report or misplace a stapler, just so the major doesn't have to be alone. They'll sit in companionable silence, occasionally interrupted by the soft clink of a mug or the distant hum of a laser grid resetting. And in those quiet moments, something rare happens. The major smiles, not the half smirk of approval, not the tight-lipped expression he gives to maintain composure. A real smile. The kind that reaches his eyes and softens the hard edges of his face. For a brief moment, he lets his guard down. Just a little. Enough to remember that even commanders need company, that even voices of authority deserve to rest. But then the moment passes. The mission clock ticks forward. A new alert flashes on the console, and once again, he becomes the Major. The commanding voice of order in a world that refuses to stay still. He stands back straight. One last check of the surveillance feeds, one last sip of cold coffee. And then, with all the practiced calm of someone who's done this more times than he can count, he presses the button on the intercom. "Carl," he says, "wake up the squirrel. We've got another assignment." "Yes, sir," comes the cheery reply. The screen lights up. Agent P is already in motion. Another day begins, another operation underway. And in the center of it all, just off-screen, mostly unseen, and often underappreciated, is Major Monogram. Always watching, always guiding, always ready. He may never be the star of the show. He may never get the big moment or the dramatic monologue, but that's never been the point. Because in the quiet corners of the world, real heroes don't shout. They don't demand the spotlight. They don't ask for praise. They lead. And they do it with quiet conviction, with loyalty, with a voice that says, even in the darkest hour, we're still in control. And so he stays at his post, mustache neat, voice strong, heart steady. Because someone has to. And no one does it better than Major Francis Monogram. Long before the commands, the uniforms, and the endless reports, there was simply Francis. Not Major, not Sir. Just a boy with a quiet gaze and a deep fascination for structure. The kind of boy who lined up his toy soldiers by height and alphabetized his snack labels before eating them. Francis Monogram didn't grow up in the spotlight. His home was modest, 3 rooms, 1 hallway, and a view of the neighbor's lemon tree that he pretended was a distant mountain range. His parents were kind but busy. His mother a nurse who worked long hours, and his father a train conductor, always moving from one station to the next. They loved him, no doubt, but their time was limited, carved out between shifts and schedules. So Francis learned early how to keep himself company. He found comfort in order, in symmetry, in the quiet assurance that everything had a place and a purpose. When things were neat, the world made sense. He was never the loudest in the classroom, nor the most athletic, but he was the first to raise his hand when the teacher asked for a volunteer, the first to organize a lost and found system for the school's missing library books, the one who stayed behind to help stack chairs even if no one noticed. But someone did. Her name was Eloise. She was the only other student who arrived at school early, not because she had to, but because she liked the stillness before the chaos. They'd often share a quiet bench in the hallway, each reading their own books, occasionally exchanging glances, and even more occasionally, words. She once told him he had an old soul. Francis had tilted his head, unsure if that was a compliment. She'd smiled and said, "That's a good thing. Old souls see the world slower, clearer." Eloise moved away a few months later. Her father got transferred to another city. She left behind a note in Francis's locker, neat handwriting, folded twice, with a lemon blossom tucked inside. He never replied. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. Even then, feelings were a messy thing for him. Harder to sort than paper clips or files, easier to leave folded. Still, he kept that note. It lives to this day, tucked in a drawer behind his commendation medals. He's never shown it to anyone, not even Carl. As he got older, Francis leaned more into discipline. He joined every leadership program, applied for cadet school, and was accepted without hesitation. It wasn't a military school exactly, but it trained future leaders for various secret organizations across the country. He didn't know it at the time, but this was his first step toward OWCA. Training was rigorous but fulfilling. He was up before dawn, memorizing procedures and learning tactical theory. He was never the strongest cadet in combat drills, but he was always the most consistent. His evaluations were filled with terms like efficient, dependable, and precise. Still, there were moments of doubt. He'd lie awake at night, bunk creaking beneath him, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes he wondered if he was meant for something more personal, something outside the spreadsheets and marching formations. But those thoughts never lasted long, because there was a sense of peace and structure, a safety in knowing exactly what was expected of you and doing it well. One day, a visiting officer came to evaluate the cadets, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a strange briefcase full of animal dossier. He didn't smile often, but when he watched Francis coordinate a multi-stage training simulation, he nodded once, slowly, and made a mark in his book. 3 weeks later, Francis received a letter. It was printed on thick paper, and the letterhead read, OWCA, the organization without a cool acronym. He thought it was a joke at first, but it wasn't. And so began the life of Major Monogram, not in a blaze of glory or a grand ceremony, but with a hallway meeting, a paper badge, and a single sentence spoken by that same quiet man. You're not flashy, Monogram, but you're exactly what we need. His first assignment wasn't dramatic. He was stationed at a small OWCA outpost in the suburbs, a low-risk, low-profile division, responsible for coordinating fieldwork for just 3 agents. One of them was a chameleon with mild social anxiety. Another was a hamster who could parachute out of high places but refused to work weekends. The third was a platypus in training, younger than most, barely old enough to qualify. His name was Perry. Francis was still learning, too, adjusting to life behind a console, managing mission updates, and learning the inner workings of OWCA's animal-based agent system. He took copious notes, filled entire notebooks with mission breakdowns, communication logs, and personal observations. There was no one telling him to do that. He simply believed that details mattered. Perry, even back then, was unique, quiet, disciplined, curious. There was a spark in him that Francis couldn't quite define, but he recognized potential when he saw it. And in some quiet corner of his heart, he also saw himself. There was a stillness in Perry's demeanor that matched his own, a kind of wordless responsibility. He wasn't the strongest or flashiest agent, but he was focused, reliable, just like Francis. Over time, they fell into an unspoken rhythm. Francis would monitor the mission. Perry would execute it. Francis would log the data. Perry would return with a slight nod of completion. No need for flair, no request for recognition. Just quiet competence. The outpost was small, but it became a second home. The walls were thin, the coffee bitter, and the funding practically non-existent. But Francis loved it. He took care of the place as if it were his own, kept it spotless, repaired equipment by hand when the budget didn't allow replacements, even stitched up the office chair's torn armrests with a borrowed sewing kit. Sometimes he'd spend his evenings alone there, running simulations just to improve Perry's success rates, not because anyone demanded it, but because he wanted to see the platypus succeed. That was his way of caring. Not through hugs or speeches, but through time, effort, and silent support. Then one day, a classified operation went wrong. An experienced agent failed to report in. Emergency channels lit up. Francis was told to hold position. Higher-ups would investigate. But he couldn't sit idle. He scanned through every communication trace, cross-referenced satellite feeds, and triangulated last known coordinates. It took him 11 straight hours. But he found the missing agent, unconscious but alive, trapped beneath a collapsed silo. He didn't wait for orders. He called in a recovery team, rerouted field units, and supervised the rescue himself. By the time the higher command arrived, it was done. They were not pleased that he'd acted without authorization, but they couldn't argue with the result. The agent had survived, the intel was intact, and Francis had demonstrated something far more valuable than obedience. He'd shown initiative, judgment, leadership. A few weeks later, a new assignment came through. A full promotion to oversee a broader region. More agents, more responsibility, more paperwork. He accepted it quietly, packing his notebooks, mission logs, and the framed OWCA emblem he'd crafted from paperclips and glue one rainy night at the outpost. And though he'd moved offices, upgraded to a better coffee machine, and eventually got a proper assistant in Carl, he never quite left behind that small, dusty outpost where it all began. In fact, on certain anniversaries, when the calendar hits the exact date he found that missing agent, he still visits, late at night, alone. He checks the old systems, now inactive, long replaced, and sits at the same console with a thermos of tea. Just to remember where he started. Just to remind himself of the boy who found comfort in routine, who answered the strange letter, and who chose a life not of glory, but of quiet service. As years passed, Francis Monogram's voice grew firmer, his posture straighter, and his schedule even more tightly wound. But somewhere along the way, that boy from the hallway bench never truly disappeared. He just got quieter, hidden behind protocol and professionalism, tucked into routines and rehearsals. By the time he reached full regional command, he'd become Major Monogram in both title and reputation. His days were filled with briefings, strategy meetings, and what he liked to call corridor supervision, a fancy way of describing his subtle habit of pacing the headquarters to make sure everything was in its right place. He had a reputation now. Agents referred to him with respect, even if some of them only knew him as the serious voice from the monitor. Others, like Perry, knew more, not through words, but through time, through presence, through those quiet hours when the mission had ended. And Monogram was still there, eyes on the screens, making sure every agent got home safe. And yet, even in his growing position of leadership, he always made time for the smallest details. He remembered agents' favorite snack brands for mission kits. He personally reviewed training reports for new recruits, even when it wasn't required. He had Carl organize birthdays, but only under strict instruction that they be low-key, quiet affairs with no streamers or singing, just cake, just recognition. Because Francis understood what it felt like to go unseen. He knew how far a small gesture could go, but for all the care he extended outward, inwardly, he remained closed off. He lived alone in a modest apartment just 3 blocks from HQ. His kitchen was clean, the fridge sparse. There was a recliner, a lamp, and an ancient record player that rarely saw use. He had a hobby once whittling. He'd picked it up during a 2-week sabbatical that he'd been forced to take. He carved small wooden animals, not perfectly, but thoughtfully. There was a duck with a too large bill, a squirrel with lopsided ears, and a platypus that bore a suspicious resemblance to someone in a hat. They sit on his shelf, not where visitors can see, but where he can when he takes his rare moments of stillness. He tells Carl that the whittling was just something to pass the time, but the care in the curves and the hours he spent smoothing their edges speak of something deeper, a yearning for quiet connection, a reminder that not everything in his life had to serve a mission. Still, personal life remained something of a ghost. He went on a few dates in his younger days, always arranged by well-meaning colleagues. But every time the same pattern emerged. He'd spend more time analyzing the restaurant's fire exits or mentally calculating escape routes than actually engaging in conversation. It wasn't that he wasn't interested. He simply didn't know how to turn off the part of his brain that was always scanning, always evaluating, always preparing. Relationships required vulnerability, and to Francis, vulnerability felt like disorder, like letting your carefully arranged files scatter in the wind. So he folded that part of himself away, much like he did Eloise's note, neatly, gently, and he focused on what he knew how to do best serve. It doesn't mean he doesn't feel. He does, deeply, in ways he doesn't often show, like when an agent is injured and he visits the recovery bay at night just to stand quietly outside the glass, or when he re-watches old mission footage, not to evaluate performance, but to remember the early days, the simpler days, when it was just him and Perry and a handful of files in a tiny room. He'll never say it, but he misses those days. Not because they were easier, they weren't, but because they were his foundation, his beginning, the moments that built the man behind the title. And though he wears the badge with pride and delivers his briefings with practiced ease, there's still a part of him that wonders what life might have been like had he taken a different path. Had he written back to Eloise? Had he taken the island trip? Had he let himself be more than a command structure? But then he sees a new recruit step into their first mission. Or he hears Carl humming some old theme song in the hallway. Or he gets a simple nod from Perry after a successful assignment. And he remembers. This path may be lonely, but it's still home. Every so often, Major Monogram receives a letter from his mother. They always begin the same way. "Francis, dear, are you remembering to eat enough greens?" And they always end with a small reminder that she's proud of him, even if she still doesn't quite understand what he does. She thinks he works in environmental coordination. That's the cover story OWCA provides to all non-cleared civilians. Monogram lets her believe it, not out of secrecy, but out of comfort. If she thinks he spends his days making neighborhoods more environmentally friendly, then she can sleep peacefully at night. He sends her postcards in return. They're always short, always signed with "Love, Francis." Sometimes they include small sketches, never detailed, just quick doodles of ducks or trees. He likes to think they make her smile. Beneath the uniform, the titles, and the mustache, he is still a son. Still a man who once clutched a notebook and waited anxiously outside a locked office. Still someone who looks in the mirror and wonders, even now, if he's doing enough. In many ways, that is what defines Major Monogram. Not his accolades, not the missions, not even the iconic mustache. It's the quiet drive within him, not to be perfect, but to be useful, to matter in ways that don't demand attention, but deliver results. It's why he memorizes every agent's name, even those he never meets in person. It's why he still reads every after-action report, no matter how minor the mission. And it's why, late at night, when the lights are dim in HQ and most agents are long gone, he sometimes walks the empty halls just to make sure everything is as it should be. There's no glory in it. No one sees those steps. But that's never been the point. He is the kind of man who keeps things steady. A pillar. A lighthouse. And in a world where chaos often takes center stage, where wild inventions and unpredictable villains are part of the daily rhythm, that steadiness is more valuable than it looks. Even Carl, as scattered and whimsical as he may seem, recognizes this. Beneath the sarcasm and the playful tone, there's a deep respect between them. Carl once said during a particularly stressful HQ malfunction, "The only reason this place hasn't turned into a flaming mess is because you never look away, sir." Francis didn't respond at the time, just nodded. But he remembered it. Logged it into the quiet file in his mind labeled affirmations I'll never repeat, but secretly keep. For all his formality, he holds these moments close. And Perry. Perry is perhaps the one being who understands him without needing words. Over the years, their bond has only strengthened. Missions have come and gone. Crises have risen and fallen, but their rhythm remains. When Francis gives an order, Perry responds with action. When the screen flickers to life and Perry salutes, Monogram returns it with the same respect, not out of rank, but out of mutual trust. They are not friends in the traditional sense. They don't share dinners or tell stories over drinks. But in that quiet professional rhythm, there is something even stronger. A loyalty born of consistency, a respect carved from years of unspoken understanding. And perhaps that's the most honest form of connection Francis Monogram can allow himself. Not grand, not flashy, but solid, quiet, lasting. So when the world spins too fast, or when agents look to HQ for guidance, they know they can count on the man whose voice booms through the monitors with calm authority. The man with the neat mustache, the crisp uniform, and the clipboard that somehow never leaves his hand. Because behind that mustache lives a man of deep structure, one who gave up comfort for purpose, who chose order in a world of chaos, who sees the smallest details and guards them like treasure, a man who never needed the spotlight to shine, because he was always the one holding the light steady for everyone else. The training room at OWCA isn't where legends are born, but it's where they're built. Long before agents are assigned their signature fedoras or jetpacks, they train here. The padded walls are scuffed from decades of failed flips. The air always smells faintly of antiseptic and fur, and the equipment is older than most of the recruits. It's far from glamorous. But for Major Monogram, it's sacred ground. This is where order begins, where instincts are honed into discipline, where raw potential is quietly shaped into something formidable. And over the years, Francis has watched hundreds of agents pass through its doors clumsy, wide-eyed, eager, and leave a little more focused, a little more ready. He never set out to be a mentor. He was trained for logistics, for protocol, for behind-the-scenes command. But time has a way of shifting roles, and somewhere along the way, he became more than just a commander. He became a guide. Not the kind who cheers from the sidelines or delivers rousing speeches. No, his guidance is quiet, structured. A raised eyebrow when an agent underperforms. A silent nod when one exceeds expectations. He trains not with volume, but with consistency. That's what the agents come to trust. In the early days, when Perry was still a rookie, Monogram would stay late reviewing his simulation tapes frame by frame. He'd circle the moments that showed hesitation, slow the feed at key decision points, and leave notes in blue pen. Good instincts. Needs quicker retraction on grapple deployment. Too much force here. Remember, subtlety is key. Perfect timing reinforces pattern. Perry never responded to the notes, but he adjusted. Quietly. Precisely. Monogram noticed. Always. As OWCA grew, more agents came through the system, a new wave of animal recruits, each with their own quirks, strengths, and challenges. Not every agent was a Perry. Some had talent, but no discipline. Others were loyal, but reckless. Some simply didn't fit. Francis tried with all of them. He designed new drills, adjusted mission simulations to accommodate various skill sets, rewrote training manuals so they were clearer, tighter, more efficient. He took it personally when an agent failed out. Not because it reflected poorly on him, but because he believed every recruit deserved a chance to become their best. And if they didn't reach that level, he wondered what more he could have done. Over time, the job of training became more layered. Bureaucracy crept in. Committees, forms, rankings, reports upon reports. Francis filed them all, read every detail. But something in him ached each time a promising recruit washed out due to a technicality, or worse, because no one had taken the time to see what lay beneath the surface. One agent in particular stayed with him. Agent Truffle, a pot-bellied pig with a photographic memory and a love for classical music. She excelled in strategy, but panicked in the field. Her reports were meticulous, her instincts sharp, but she couldn't clear the standard obstacle course without freezing halfway through. The board suggested decommissioning. Francis intervened. He built her a new training model, quieter, more cerebral, less physical pressure, more scenario analysis. She flourished. Became one of OWCA's top intelligence analysts. Never saw field duty again. Didn't need to. Francis still receives thank you notes from her, handwritten, always scented faintly of lavender. That's what training became for him, not just routines or drills, but adaptation. Recognizing that agents are not one-size-fits-all. They are individuals with unique rhythms and needs, and the best command is the one that listens before it instructs. But with all the training, the structuring, the reshaping, something else quietly slipped away. Time. Time for himself, for breath, for reflection. There were nights when the hallways of OWCA felt endless. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the soft hum of computers still running in empty rooms. Monogram would walk alone, clipboard in hand, reviewing performance logs and security protocols long after the building should have gone quiet. Carl would sometimes stay late too, pretending to sort files or recalibrate the coffee machine, but Monogram knew Carl didn't want him to be alone. Monogram appreciated it in his own way. He would never say so out loud, of course. That wasn't how he operated. But on certain occasions, he'd stop by Carl's desk with an extra donut from the break room, placed without comment. A silent thank you, one that Carl always understood. Still, despite the loyal team and the pride of watching recruits rise into full agents, the work was relentless. Every success came with new expectations. Every failure lingered longer than it should. Time started slipping, not just hours in the day, but the things that made life feel like more than duty. He hadn't gone fishing in years. His collection of historical espionage novels remained half-read on his bookshelf. He couldn't remember the last time he'd called his college friend Herbert, who still sent him a birthday card every year with a drawing of a duck in a tuxedo. There were always more recruits, more drills to oversee, more missions to plan. At some point, the man behind the mustache began to blur into the mustache itself, the image, the role, the ever-watchful command figure. And Francis Monogram, the person, became harder to spot in the reflection of the control room monitors. Sometimes he wondered if this was what he'd chosen, or simply what had chosen him. He didn't regret it, not really. The agents mattered. The mission mattered. The world needed OWCA to function with precision. But he also knew, deep down, that something had been traded along the way. He could recall a moment years ago during a particularly tense week of agent evaluations. He'd stood in front of the mirror in the locker room, fixing his collar, and for the briefest instant, he didn't recognize the man looking back. Not because he looked older, though he certainly did, but because he looked tired. Not physically, but somewhere deeper. Like a man who had handed over his hours one by one, year after year, in service of something bigger, and now had very few left for himself. The realization was fleeting, brushed aside by a ping from his wrist communicator and an urgent message from Carl about a stuck vending machine. But it stayed tucked somewhere behind his eyes after that. A quiet awareness. He didn't dwell on it. That wasn't his way. But it informed him. made him a little gentler during evaluations, a little more patient with agents who needed time, a little more willing to let Carl take the lead during certain briefings, even if it meant enduring some bizarre multimedia presentations. Because Monogram knew the value of time and the cost of losing it. And in training others to become the best version of themselves, he had given up the space to become anything other than what was needed. He didn't resent the sacrifice, but he acknowledged it. And sometimes that was enough. Enough to keep him centered, enough to keep him present, enough to remind him that even if he wasn't out in the field like the agents he trained, he was still a part of every success they achieved, every mission that ended in peace, every time the world stayed safe, and no one even realized it had been in danger, because behind every agent was the steady hand that trained them. The man who stood in the shadows of the training room, stopwatch in hand, never asking for thanks, only improvement. Francis Monogram, still watching, still guiding, still giving. Some of the agents didn't realize just how much Monogram had done for them. They came in young, some of them barely out of their eggs, or in Agent P's case, his burrow, and graduated into sleek, capable field agents. For them, the transition from training to missions was seamless. That was the design. Monogram never wanted them to feel the burden of how much work went into each of their journeys. Behind the perfect mission briefings and cool gadgetry was a man who had memorized every strength, every weakness, who had filed endless reports, negotiated for better resources, and sat in on every disciplinary hearing with the quiet dignity of someone who saw potential before anyone else did. He didn't need the agents to know. That wasn't why he did it, but still, on the rare occasions when an agent sent him a thank you card or dropped by with a homemade treat after a particularly tough mission, his face would soften. His mustache would twitch just slightly upward. Those little moments meant more than they'd ever know. Carl knew. Carl always knew. He kept a drawer in his desk full of little tributes to Monogram, a photo of Agent P's first solo mission, a thank you card from Agent E, the emu with a heart of gold, and a napkin sketch by an otter agent who had drawn Monogram as a superhero in uniform. Francis pretended not to know about the drawer, but sometimes, when the hallways were empty and the weight of the day sat too heavy on his shoulders, he'd wander into Carl's office. They wouldn't talk much. Carl might say something about the coffee being too strong. Monogram would nod and take a sip anyway. Then he'd glance at that drawer and remember that what he was doing mattered. But the loss of time lingered, like dust in the corners of his life. He missed his niece's dance recitals. He forgot his neighbor's birthday 3 years in a row. His favorite mug, the one with the #1 commanding officer print, had chipped, and he never got around to replacing it. Each forgotten moment was a quiet reminder that he was pouring everything into the agents and leaving little behind for himself. There were times he considered taking a sabbatical. Carl had suggested it once, very gently after Monogram had worked 15 days straight. You could go somewhere, Carl had offered. Maybe the beach, read a book, not be responsible for everyone for a while. Monogram had chuckled, the sound dry and unused. If I go, who makes sure the agents stay sharp? Carl had a reply ready. They'll be okay for a week, sir. You've trained them well. But Monogram had waved him off. I know, that's the problem. I'd miss it. He always did. The truth was, as much as the job drained him, he couldn't imagine life without it. He didn't know who he was without the reports, the rosters, the training sessions. The structure kept him steady. The schedule gave his days meaning. Still, the thought stayed with him. The image of himself on a quiet dock, perhaps fishing, perhaps not. A thermos of warm coffee beside him. No alarms, no emergencies. Just silence. It wasn't a fantasy he allowed himself often, but when he did, it brought a strange calm. And perhaps, deep down, he knew that day might come not soon, but eventually, when the world didn't need him quite so urgently. When the agents he trained were training the next generation. And when the mustache became more memory than mission. Until then, he'd keep showing up. Keep fixing that stiff green uniform each morning. Keep adjusting mission protocols and refining obstacle courses. Keep mentoring with quiet resolve. Because that's what Major Monogram did. He trained others to be strong, even when it meant losing the strength to be anything else. Somewhere in OWCA's lower levels, down a hallway most agents never entered, was a storage room labeled Archives Active Retired. It was filled with rows of file cabinets and dusty manila folders, each one housing the career history of an agent. Some were thick with commendations and field notes, others were brief, but no less meaningful. Monogram often visited that room in quiet moments. He'd run his fingers along the labels, pulling one out at random. Agent K. Kangaroo, highly energetic, struggled with stealth but had an uncanny knack for aerial flips. Monogram had personally designed her training regimen to harness her energy rather than suppress it. Agent J. Jellyfish, brilliant in underwater operations, but had once short-circuited a vital communications relay by accident. Monogram had stayed late that night rewriting mission protocols to prevent future issues. Each file, each agent, was a chapter in the story of his work. He remembered them all, not just as operatives, but as individuals, their quirks, their breakthroughs, the way they grew from unsure recruits into defenders of peace. He never boasted about his influence. But deep down, he took pride in knowing he'd shaped something enduring. The training facility itself bore subtle marks of his presence, not just structurally, but spiritually. The color-coded stations he insisted on. The motivational signs Carl had posted on his behalf with phrases like, "Precision beats panic, and we don't wing it, we OWCA it." Sometimes agents rolled their eyes at the slogans. But when things got tough out in the field, those were the phrases they remembered. The training room mats were worn smooth in places a testament to the years of flips, rolls, and tumbles. Monogram never replaced them unnecessarily. He liked that they told a story, that every scuff and patch had a name behind it. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't like the doomsday devices or rooftop battles. But it mattered. And on nights when he sat at his desk, and the training logs glowing softly on the screen, he knew this was his legacy. Not in the field, not in the spotlight, but in the preparation, in the silent, methodical crafting of heroes. He often thought about Agent P. The Platypus had gone from unassuming to unstoppable, not because of some natural gift, although he certainly had talent, but because someone believed in him, guided him, refused to let him be anything less than extraordinary. That was the invisible hand of Francis Monogram. A life spent preparing others to shine, even if it meant dimming his own light. And yes, it cost him. Time, energy, pieces of his own story that were never written because he was too busy helping others write theirs. But every time an agent succeeded, every time OWCA stood firm, every time the world slept soundly, that was enough. He didn't need medals, he didn't need murals, he didn't need anyone to say his name with awe. He only needed to know they were ready. And if one day they looked back, perhaps they'd remember the man who never stopped preparing them, the voice who stood steady when things felt uncertain, the figure behind the clipboard, behind the mustache, behind the curtain, making sure they could become the very best. That was his purpose. That was his time, even if it didn't feel like his. There were photographs in his office. Not many. He wasn't one for personal displays, but just enough to hint at a story few ever saw. One frame held a snapshot from his academy days, a grainy image of a younger Francis Monogram, freshly uniformed, his posture rigid, but eyes uncertain. He stood beside his training partner, a now retired agent, whose name had faded from the records but not from his memory. They were both saluting the camera, the edges of their expressions trying not to smile, trying too hard to be soldiers. In another frame, mounted slightly crooked as though it had been adjusted by Carl in a rush, sat a photo of Monogram and Agent P after a successful mission. Perry, mid-blink, looked confused by the camera's flash. Monogram, on the other hand, looked proud not because of the mission's outcome, but because of what it represented. A silent agent doing remarkable things, and a commander who had quietly helped pave the way. The walls weren't cluttered, but they were deliberate. Every item told a chapter of his life, a life that had grown full of symbols and silence. The name Monogram itself had become symbolic. It was crisp, memorable, and respected in the agency halls. Agents invoked it when quoting protocol. Recruits whispered it with both reverence and fear. But to Francis, it was still just his name. It wasn't grandeur he sought. It was duty. He remembered a time before the name carried weight, when he was still unsure of his voice, when his directives wavered and his hands trembled behind the mission files. In those days, every choice felt like a gamble, every failure personal. But slowly, experience hardened him. Not cruelly, not coldly, but into something solid, something that others could lean on. He never kept trophies. No medals, no plaques. The accolades were always offered, but he declined more often than not. What did he need a ribbon for when his victory was the strength of the team? Still, the memories held him when the building emptied out. Late at night, when the fluorescent lights flickered too long in the hallway and the clicking of Carl's keyboard became the only sound, Monogram would lean back in his chair. His eyes would drift not to the screen, but to the past. The academy sparring matches, where he'd been outclassed but never gave up. The first time he was asked to lead a small, chaotic assignment, involving a rogue otter and a submarine. He barely made it through. But afterward, his superior had simply said, "You kept them safe. That's all that matters." He never forgot that. The memory of those early assignments lived in the lines on his face. Not regrets, never regrets, but etchings of time past, lessons earned. Carl once asked him if he missed being in the field. Monogram had smiled. "Not the paperwork," he replied dryly, "but yes, sometimes." And yet even then he knew his strength had never been in punches or pursuit. His power came from what he built behind the scenes, from his ability to see potential before others did, to take what was raw, reckless, or unsure and shape it into something lasting. He remembered training Agent R, the raccoon with kleptomaniac tendencies. Everyone else wrote her off. Monogram didn't. He saw intelligence buried under the impulse, control hidden behind the chaos. He gave her purpose. By the time she retired, she dismantled 4 major syndicates and trained a dozen junior agents herself. Those stories, those memories were his trophies. He kept them in his mind like sacred files. He remembered names, missions, mistakes, redemptions. And when the silence of night blanketed OWCA like a tired sigh, those memories whispered back. They told him he had mattered, even when no one said it out loud. Even when the world moved on. Even when new agents filled the halls and didn't recognize his full name, just Major. That was okay, because the work lived on, and that was all he ever needed. There was a small drawer in his desk, locked, not because of secrecy, but because of sentiment. Inside it, carefully kept, were things that had no place in an official file, a collection of memories in physical form. A faded letter from a junior agent, thanking him for a second chance. A childlike drawing from Carl, made on one of those OWCA family fun days long ago where staff could bring their relatives. The picture showed Monogram with an impossibly square jaw and a cape, flying beside Perry and Carl like superheroes. Monogram kept it, not because of the art, which was terrible, but because of what it symbolized. There were also mission badges, not his own, but ones retired agents had mailed back to him when they moved on. Some had little notes attached, scribbled in haste or with emotion. Wouldn't have made it without your guidance, or for all the early mornings and impossible drills, thank you. They weren't things most people ever saw. He didn't display them. He didn't mention them. But he remembered each one. Sometimes, when the day grew especially long, and the stress seeped into his bones, he'd open the drawer slowly, as though reverent of what it held. A quick glance was enough, just enough to remind him that what he did mattered, that it reached people, even if only quietly. Memories, after all, were never loud. They lingered like echoes, soft, steady, full of presence. And Monogram lived among them. He often wondered how he'd be remembered. Would the younger agents know anything beyond his stern voice and rigid posture? Would they know about the long nights he stayed behind to rewrite training modules, or the way he defended agents who made mistakes, shielding them from upper-level reprimands? Would they remember that he wasn't just the one giving orders, he was the one who never stopped caring? He doubted it, but still it was okay. He had no illusion of being the hero. That was Perry's role. That was what the world saw. Monogram, he was the steady hand, the command behind the curtain, the man who made sure the mission could even begin. He once overheard a young recruit talking about him. They said, Major Monogram's like the furniture, always there, always the same. It made him chuckle, though just a little. Not because it was flattering, it wasn't, but because it was unintentionally true. Furniture didn't move. Furniture held everything up. It was always there. And in a strange, steady way, so was he. Even Carl had started to notice how his habits didn't change. Every morning, at precisely 8 o'clock, Monogram entered the office. Tea, not coffee, 1 sugar, no milk. Same breakfast, dry toast, and 1 boiled egg. Same routine. Review agent logs, check OWCA perimeter systems, update mission queue. Carl once joked, if OWCA collapsed, you'd still show up at 8 sharp, wouldn't you? Monogram had replied without irony, of course. Someone has to be here in case it doesn't. There was something poetic in that a man who lived by duty, defined by consistency. And yet beneath all that order and structure lived a mind brimming with stories. Stories only he carried. Stories no database could ever capture. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't share much. But the memories lived on in him like stars behind clouds, always there, even when invisible. And when the building emptied and the lights dimmed low, those stars quietly filled the sky of his thoughts. One evening, long after the sun had dipped behind the city and OCA's corridors stood hushed and dim, Monogram found himself alone in the briefing room. It wasn't intentional. He'd merely been sorting mission files when his eyes had drifted to the room's main screen, now dark and silent. He stepped inside almost without realizing it, drawn by something heavier than routine. The chairs, always arranged perfectly, reminded him of training sessions, of young agents sitting upright, wide-eyed and half confused. He remembered walking up and down those rows, lecturing, advising, correcting. Sometimes he was strict, sometimes he was kind, but always he tried to make sure they left smarter than they arrived. He sat down not at the podium, but at one of the empty chairs, somewhere in the middle. It was rare, almost unheard of, for him to take this seat. The room looked different from here, less commanding, more human. The floor felt colder, the walls farther away. He could almost hear echoes of voices past, both real and imagined. "You've got potential," he once told an agent, who'd failed 3 trials in a row. That same agent now led an elite recon unit. "Not every mission ends in success. What matters is what you learn," he'd said after a team returned broken and bruised. "I trust you," were the words he only gave sparingly, but when he did, they stayed with people for years. Those weren't just lessons. They were pieces of him. And now, as he sat among the ghosts of his own guidance, he felt something unfamiliar stir beneath his otherwise composed exterior nostalgia, not the kind that aches, but the kind that warms, the kind that reminds you that time, though always moving, leaves traces of itself in all you've built. He stood slowly, his knees creaking in quiet protest, and walked back toward the hallway. But before leaving, he paused at the doorway and looked back one last time. It wasn't the room that held him. It was everything that had happened in it. Back in his office, Carl had left a sticky note on his desk. It was, as always, comically informal. "Tried to fix the vending machine again. It might now dispense both soup and socks. Sorry." Monogram smirked. Of course it would. Carl, for all his quirks, had become one of the few constants in his life. What began as an intern-superior relationship had matured into something far more layered. Carl understood him, not just his habits, but his silences, his long pauses, the way he stared off into the distance when no one was speaking. They didn't need to say much anymore. A glance, a sigh, a raised eyebrow. That was often enough. Sometimes, Monogram wondered what would happen when he stepped down. Would Carl take over? Would the agency adapt? Would the morning routines continue in someone else's hands? Would they still salute the same way? Would anyone remember the quiet changes he made? He tried not to dwell on it. Legacy, after all, wasn't what he served for. He served because he believed in something bigger than himself, a world that needed order, safety, and the rare calm that only a well-run agency could bring. Still, on quieter nights, when the wind whistled against OWCA's windows and the moonlight cast shadows across the mission board, he allowed himself the smallest hope. That somewhere, years from now, an agent would recall an old commander's voice, not stern, not cold, but steady, and feel guided, even if just for a moment. Because memories don't just live in photo frames or dusty reports. They live in people, in the choices they make, in the calm they carry into chaos. And Monogram had always been that calm. In the very back corner of OWCA's underground archive, the part few ever visited was a section labeled Historical Assets. Inside, stacked neatly on old shelves, were rows of retired gadgets, faded uniforms, and decades' worth of agent dossiers. And tucked into a metal drawer under the M file was a slim, sealed folder. Its cover was plain, except for the label, Monogram, F. Personal Notes, Restricted Access. Carl had once stumbled across it during an inventory check. Naturally curious, he asked Monogram what was inside. The Major just looked up from his monitor and said, "Reflections. Notes for whoever sits in this chair next." That was all he ever said on the matter. But those pages, they weren't instructions. They were stories. Observations from a life lived behind mission logs and camera feeds. Quiet musings written in the margins of a career built on order. In one note, he wrote, "You won't always know if you did the right thing, but if you did it for the right reasons, that's usually enough." In another, "Leadership is not about being followed. It's about holding steady when others can't." And then, "Carl eats all the good snacks when he thinks I'm not looking. I let him. Makes him happy." It was there, in these quiet scribbles, that the man behind the uniform truly lived, the one who could deliver tactical briefings at dawn, then pause to ensure his staff remembered to drink water and go home on time. The one who taught agents how to disarm traps and, without saying it outright, taught them how to carry themselves with honor. In many ways, those notes were more valuable than any mission blueprint or enemy dossier. They weren't about defeating villains or managing crises. They were about enduring, about how to serve in silence and still hold on to yourself. And when the time finally came, though it hadn't yet, when someone else sat in his chair, they'd find those notes waiting, not as instructions, but as reminders of who he was, of what this place meant, of why it mattered. Back in his office, the clock ticked softly. The world outside remained unaware of the quiet legacy built within these walls. Monogram glanced at the mission screen one last time before logging off. He adjusted his collar, straightened a crooked file on the desk, and nodded once to no one in particular. He had given everything he had, and he would keep giving until the very end. Because this wasn't just his job, it was his memory made real. A place where his past, present, and purpose lived side by side. And in the stillness of that moment, with only the hum of the headquarters around him, Major Monogram did something he rarely allowed himself. He closed his eyes, not to rest, but to remember. There are parts of command that no one prepares you for. The manuals and training simulations cover strategy, structure, and success. They teach you how to lead an operation, how to manage agents, and how to stay cool under pressure. But what they never cover, what no lecture ever truly prepares you for, is the silence that follows a hard decision. That silence that lingers longer than any enemy ever could. Major Monogram knew that silence well. It came most often after the missions that didn't go as planned. Not failures, necessarily. OWCA was careful with its fieldwork, but moments when the cost of a decision wasn't measured in property damage or missed intel, but in people. When a call from headquarters made in the heat of the moment left ripples that couldn't be undone. One such decision had followed him for years. It had started like any other mission. A medium-level villain, classified under moderately dangerous but theatrical, had begun a campaign to freeze the local power grid using a misguided fusion of ice cream truck technology and dark matter crystals. Standard stuff for the agency. A team of 3 agents had been dispatched, skilled, alert, dependable. But weather conditions shifted. The villain's tech, unpredictable by nature, overloaded and surged into full-blown chaos. Headquarters detected the spike just as the team arrived. Monogram had seconds to respond, pull the team back, and risk the villain disappearing again. Send backup and risk wider detection. Or trust the lead agent, someone he had trained personally, to make the call in the field. He chose the third, and for a few hours it looked like the right one, until the ice field collapsed beneath Agent Lemur's feet, until the backup arrived too late, until Monogram heard the words, "One agent down, sir." That sentence had haunted him, not because it meant failure, but because it meant consequence. He'd rewatched the feed dozens of times, every angle, every decision, every sound bite. And yet no matter how often he reviewed it, the outcome never changed. Agent Lemur had been young, sharp, loyal, with a humor that undercut even the toughest mission debriefs. She used to bring cinnamon gum to briefings and quietly slide it across the table to Carl when Monogram wasn't looking, as if Monogram didn't notice. He remembered her graduation, the way she stood straighter than anyone else, the way her parents wept quietly in the back, the way she smiled when she received her badge. He had written the letter to them himself, no assistant, no auto-template. Your daughter served with courage and distinction. We remember her not only as an agent, but as a person who made OWCA better. And even now, years later, that letter still felt inadequate. Because no matter how deep the briefing went, or how careful the call, command meant sending people into uncertainty. And sometimes it meant not getting them back. He had spoken about it publicly only once during the annual OWCA Remembrance Ceremony. The speech was short, not because he didn't have the words, but because he didn't trust himself to say more without faltering. Some missions leave us with reports and victories, he'd said, his voice steady but low. Others leave us with silence. Let us never forget that silence is filled with names. That moment wasn't about blame. Not from the agency, not even from the family. But Monogram didn't carry regret because someone expected him to. He carried it because he expected more from himself. And while the agency moved forward, while new agents were trained and new threats emerged, he found himself glancing at the board sometimes, half expecting to see her codename again. That was the part they never told you about. That command meant remembering all the names, especially the ones you wouldn't hear again. It changed how he trained agents, subtly, but profoundly. He pushed them to think more, to trust their instincts, to speak up even when the plan was clear, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because missions were never just about tech or villains. They were about people. And regret, when it visited, didn't knock loudly. It arrived in quiet moments, while sipping lukewarm coffee, while reviewing routine updates, while hearing a laugh that sounded too familiar. Sometimes it came as he watched Carl fumble with the projector, or when a rookie agent stood a little too stiffly during roll call. It came with the reminder that time passes, that teams change, and that the past never truly leaves you. It just learns to sit quietly in the back of the room. That's how Monogram lived with it. He didn't push it away. He gave it space. Because regret, he'd learned, was not an enemy. It was a companion one that reminded him how much it mattered to lead with care. There are parts of command that no one prepares you for. The manuals and training simulations cover strategy, structure, and success. They teach you how to lead an operation, how to manage agents, and how to stay cool under pressure. But what they never cover, what no lecture ever truly prepares you for, is the silence that follows a hard decision. That silence that lingers longer than any enemy ever could. Major Monogram knew that silence well. It came most often after the missions that didn't go as planned. Not failures, necessarily. OWCA was careful with its fieldwork, but moments when the cost of a decision wasn't measured in property damage or missed intel, but in people. When a call from headquarters, made in the heat of the moment, left ripples that couldn't be undone. One such decision had followed him for years. It had started like any other mission. A medium-level villain, classified under moderately dangerous but theatrical, had begun a campaign to freeze the local power grid using a misguided fusion of ice cream truck technology and dark matter crystals. Standard stuff for the agency. A team of 3 agents had been dispatched, skilled, alert, dependable. But weather conditions shifted. The villain's tech, unpredictable by nature, overloaded and surged into full-blown chaos. Headquarters detected the spike just as the team arrived. Monogram had seconds to respond, pull the team back, and risk the villain disappearing again, send backup, and risk wider detection, or trust the lead agent, someone he had trained personally to make the call in the field. He chose the third, and for a few hours it looked like the right one, until the ice field collapsed beneath Agent Lemur's feet, until the backup arrived too late, until Monogram heard the words, "One agent down, sir." That sentence had haunted him, not because it meant failure, but because it meant consequence. He'd rewatched the feed dozens of times, every angle, every decision, every soundbite, and yet no matter how often he reviewed it, the outcome never changed. Agent Lemur had been young, sharp, loyal, with a humor that undercut even the toughest mission debriefs. She used to bring cinnamon gum to briefings and quietly slide it across the table to Carl when Monogram wasn't looking, as if Monogram didn't notice. He remembered her graduation, the way she stood straighter than anyone else, the way her parents wept quietly in the back, the way she smiled when she received her badge. He had written the letter to them himself, no assistant, no auto-template. Your daughter served with courage and distinction. We remember her not only as an agent, but as a person who made OWCA better. And even now, years later, that letter still felt inadequate. Because no matter how deep the briefing went, or how careful the call, command meant sending people into uncertainty. And sometimes it meant not getting them back. He had spoken about it publicly only once during the annual OWCA Remembrance Ceremony. The speech was short, not because he didn't have the words, but because he didn't trust himself to say more without faltering. Some missions leave us with reports and victories, he'd said, his voice steady but low. Others leave us with silence. Let us never forget that silence is filled with names. That moment wasn't about blame, not from the agency, not even from the family. But Monogram didn't carry regret because someone expected him to. He carried it because he expected more from himself. And while the agency moved forward, while new agents were trained and new threats emerged, he found himself glancing at the board sometimes, half expecting to see her code name again. That was the part they never told you about. That command meant remembering all the names, especially the ones you wouldn't hear again. It changed how he trained agents. Subtly but profoundly, he pushed them to think more, to trust their instincts, to speak up even when the plan was clear, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because missions were never just about tech or villains. They were about people. And regret, when it visited, didn't knock loudly. It arrived in quiet moments while sipping lukewarm coffee, while reviewing routine updates, while hearing a laugh that sounded too familiar. Sometimes it came as he watched Carl fumble with the projector, or when a rookie agent stood a little too stiffly during roll call. It came with the reminder that time passes, that teams change, and that the past never truly leaves you. It just learns to sit quietly in the back of the room. That's how Monogram lived with it. He didn't push it away. He gave it space. Because regret, he'd learned, was not an enemy. It was a companion one that reminded him how much it mattered to lead with care. One name on that wall always drew his eye more than the others, Agent Epsilon. Not one of the famous agents, not a Platypus, not even someone many people remembered. But to Major Monogram, Epsilon was the first agent he ever directly managed. Long before Perry, long before the OWCA protocols had become as streamlined as they were today, Epsilon had been enthusiastic, brilliant but unconventional, The kind of agent who saw problems sideways and came up with bizarre solutions that, more often than not, actually worked. But she had also been reckless, not because she was foolish, but because she believed deeply in the mission, in protecting others, in putting herself on the line. And Monogram. Young, by-the-book, idealistic, hadn't known how to manage her. They clashed. Frequently, he tried to rein her in. She pushed back. Their reports were filled with terse exchanges, each noting protocol violations or alternative assessments. But underneath that tension was respect. They both cared. They just didn't know how to say it. Her final mission had been a success, tactically speaking. But it had come at a cost. A trap she anticipated but misjudged. She neutralized the threat, but suffered a severe injury in the process, one that ended her field career. Monogram remembered sitting at her bedside afterward, holding her file, unable to look her in the eye. She had smiled, not bitterly, not sadly, just tired, and said, "Don't blame yourself, sir. I knew the risks. I made the call. That's what you trained me for, isn't it?" He had nodded, words caught in his throat. But that moment shaped him more than he'd realized. It was the first time he truly understood what it meant to lead people, not just operations, not just checklists and mission briefings, but humans, even if they were disguised as animals, even if they joked too much or broke protocol or got under his skin. They were his responsibility, and not because he could control them, but because he believed in them. After that, he started learning to listen better. He revised training standards. He introduced feedback loops that didn't just go upward, but downward from agent to commander. Epsilon had recovered, transferred to an analyst role, and eventually left the agency altogether. But Monogram still sent her a card every New Year's, just signed MM in a blocky script. She never replied, but he liked to believe she read them anyway. It was strange how much a single relationship could change the direction of his entire career. Sometimes Carl would catch him staring off after a particularly complex debrief or see him pause just before delivering a tough directive. "You okay, sir?" Monogram would nod, often with a small breath. "Just thinking." Because there were always echoes in his head of Epsilon, of Perry's early days, of agents lost or retired, of Carl's disappointed look after being told he wasn't meant for the field. They all stayed with him. Not like burdens, but like stars, scattered lights, in a sky that had grown vast over the years. He'd long since accepted that no one gets through a life of leadership unscarred, that even the best decisions sometimes hurt, that people grow and sometimes they grow away, that trying your best doesn't always feel like enough. But what mattered was staying present, staying aware, staying human. And Monogram, for all his stern edges and crisp uniforms, had a very human heart. Monogram once overheard a new recruit whispering in the hallway, "He's like a machine. Doesn't even blink when things go wrong." He didn't stop them, didn't correct them, but the words lingered. Because if only they knew how many times he had sat in this very office, long after the lights dimmed and the headquarters went quiet, going over decisions that could not be undone, the missions where an agent came back limping or never came back at all, the intelligence he didn't act on fast enough, the trap he saw too late, the warning signs missed sometimes in others, sometimes in himself. He remembered the day OWCA almost shut down. Budget cuts, policy disagreements, shifting government priorities. For a full week, the agency was in limbo. Monogram had stood before his staff, face steady, voice unwavering, and said, "We will serve until our last hour." But when the briefing ended, he sat alone in the dark and thought, What if this was all for nothing? What if, in the grand scheme, their quiet efforts went unseen? What if Perry's triumphs, as Carl's loyalty, and his own years of service, what if none of it changed anything? But then, the following morning, Carl showed up with extra donuts, just in case it's our last Monday, and Perry straightened the OWCA flag out front. Agents kept reporting in. The machine kept turning not because they were told to, but because they believed in the mission. And that reminded Monogram what mattered. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't perfect outcomes. It was intention. The unwavering effort to do what's right, even in the face of irrelevance, even when no one clapped. He sometimes thought about what retirement would look like. A quiet house, maybe a little dog, perhaps writing a book not about OWCA, but about leadership, about service, about how the real cost of command is never the strategy or the risk. It's the moments no one sees. The quiet what-ifs. The birthdays missed. The friends who drifted. The words never said. He regretted not saying more to Perry over the years about how proud he was, about how remarkable it was to watch someone so unassuming carry so much weight and never falter. He regretted the way he brushed Carl off early on. How long it took for him to see that being behind a desk didn't make someone less capable, it made them essential in a different way. He regretted not keeping in touch with some of the retired agents who helped build the agency from the ground up. So many voices lost to time. But most of all, he regretted never letting anyone see just how deeply he cared. Because in here, buried beneath discipline and duty, was a man who remembered every name, who kept every thank you note in a drawer, who once paused a global briefing to make sure an intern had eaten lunch. And maybe that wasn't what people saw when they looked at Major Monogram. But it was who he was. And on the rare nights when he allowed himself to sit without the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders, he would open that old file, the one with the handwritten notes, and quietly add another line. Not a directive, not a critique, but a truth. Something like, today, Agent E successfully diffused a volatile device using only a rubber band and a jar of pickles. I pretended not to be impressed, but I was. Carl reminded me again to drink water. I actually listened this time. Or sometimes simply, they're doing just fine without me. That means I did my job. Because perhaps that was the bittersweet secret of command. The greatest success meant eventually not being needed. And while that truth weighed heavy, it also brought peace. Because what Monogram had built, it would last. And when the time came for him to finally hang up the uniform, to pass the code book to another, he wouldn't walk away in sorrow. He would walk away with pride. And maybe, just maybe, the next commander would find those notes, read between the lines, and understand. Not the protocols, not the statistics, but the man behind the mustache. And the regrets he carried so they wouldn't have to. The lights in the OWCA command center hummed softly overhead, not harsh or sterile, but faintly warm, as if the building itself had grown accustomed to late-night vigils. Monogram sat in his chair, his silhouette framed against the soft glow of monitors, most of them idle now. The main screen still displayed a map of the tri-state area, a grid of blinking dots showing agents in standby, missions complete, and a peaceful, uneventful evening. He leaned back slightly, his hands folded over his lap, a mug of long, cold tea by his side. The mission logs had been filed. The agents had checked in. Perry had completed another operation with quiet excellence and barely a sound. Carl had gone home early, muttering something about a family board game night. And for once, there was no crisis looming. No rogue Doofenshmirtz-inhaler needing to be neutralized. It was calm. And in that calm, Major Monogram found something rare. Stillness. Not the kind born from exhaustion or emotional shutdown, but the rarest kind peace earned after a long road walked with purpose. Outside, the stars blinked against the navy sky. Inside, he was alone, but not lonely. Not tonight. He thought about how many years he had spent in this very room, how the desk had shifted slightly with each remodel, how the carpet near the command terminal was more worn than the rest, from agents pacing or pausing in anxious anticipation, how the potted plant in the corner, once a joke from Carl about making the war room more feng shui, had grown into a stubborn little tree that no one could bring themselves to remove. He thought about how often he'd stood at this post, barking orders, guiding missions, reassuring agents, always composed, always steady, and yet not always sure. He had doubted himself more times than he could count, wondered whether the structure he helped uphold truly made the world better, whether an animal agency, however absurd, was a noble cause or just another cog in a larger comedy. But the answers always came in the same quiet ways. In the thank yous after missions, in the laughter of interns, in Perry's nod of acknowledgement, in Carl's endless loyalty. So many nights he thought of stepping back, of retiring gracefully. But each time he lingered just a little longer, because someone had to be here. Someone had to remember the lessons, to honor the old files, to keep the agency steady not just for today, but for the next generation. He knew now that legacy wasn't in medals or buildings. It was in the moments people didn't notice, the doors held open, the lives protected, the team nurtured. And somewhere in all that, in the ritual and repetition, he found something sacred, a purpose that didn't dim with age. Still standing at his post meant more now than it ever had, not because he had to, but because he could, because there was something beautiful about being the last one in the room, checking the logs one final time, making sure all the dots on the screen blinked in safety and order. Because someone had to be the calm in the background, the hand on the wheel even when the seas were calm, especially then. The world had changed over the years, new gadgets, new agents, new procedures, but Monogram had remained not as a relic, but as a constant. A lighthouse in the fog, a familiar voice on the comms. He'd once feared becoming obsolete, feared becoming forgotten. But now he saw it differently. The fact that OWCA ran smoothly, that agents moved with confidence, that Carl could handle full mission briefings alone, that wasn't proof he was no longer needed. It was proof he had done his job. He wasn't the foundation because he stayed. He was the foundation because they could stand without him. Still, he stayed, because sometimes all it takes is one quiet presence to keep the whole system grounded, not flashy, not loud, just consistent. And Major Monogram, he had always known how to be consistent. As the night deepened, he reached for his old file again, the same one he always kept tucked in the second drawer, beneath the training manuals and agency memorandums. He pulled out a fresh page, blank except for the heading in his steady handwriting. Tonight, he began writing. No emergencies, no alarms, just peace. Perry returned with a small scratch. He didn't say where it came from. I didn't ask. He looked tired but content. Carl remembered to water the plant again. I think it's growing sideways now. He paused, tapping the pen gently against the desk, then added, I don't know how many more nights I'll be here, but tonight I'm here, and that's enough. The echo of his own handwriting on the page brought with it a peculiar kind of comfort. Monogram looked down at the words tidy, purposeful strokes in a sea of white, His nightly habit of logging the day, once just a formality for record-keeping, had slowly become something more intimate, a private meditation, a moment of grounding. He closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer with the same practiced care as always. Outside the command center windows, the quiet hum of the OWCA building persisted, a sound he had come to cherish. It wasn't the silence of abandonment, but the peaceful lull of stability. Once upon a time, this room had been louder, more chaotic, filled with younger voices, urgent dispatches, last-minute mission plans. There were days when he couldn't keep up with the noise, the questions, the relentless pace of an organization trying to keep the world safe in ways most people could never imagine. Back then he'd felt he had something to prove to his superiors, to his agents, to himself. He was younger, sharper in the way only youth can be, full of energy, perhaps even ego. He wore his command like armor, every decision a march, every mission a test. I would time, that sharpness soften. Not dulled, no, he would never say that. It had simply matured. These days he listened more than he spoke, trusted more than he controlled, watched more than he directed. The younger agents didn't always realize it, but his restraint was not weakness. It was experience, the knowledge that sometimes the best leaders step back, not forward. Still, he was never truly gone from the fight. He remained, even as the faces around him changed. He remembered when Agent R had retired, when Agent Q transferred to desk duty after a long field career, when Commander Bristle moved overseas to head a sister agency. One by one, the names that had once filled the break room and briefing schedules moved on, vanished into retirement or memory. And yet he stayed. It wasn't because he didn't have offers. There were other jobs, advisory roles, even lucrative book deals that came his way. But none of them had called to him the way this post did. What he had here wasn't a job. It was a calling. Carl had asked him once, during a particularly slow afternoon, why he never left. They were sitting at the lunch table eating leftover macaroni and watching a rerun of an agent training video. "Sir," Carl had said cautiously, "do you ever think about, I don't know, taking a real vacation? Like the kind with beaches and sunscreen?" Monogram had chuckled at the time, but the question lingered long after Carl had gone back to his desk. Of course, he had thought about it. Who wouldn't want to trade mission reports for the sound of crashing waves or swap high-alert protocols for a hammock and a paperback? But the truth was, those thoughts never stayed long. Because while beaches offered sun and hammocks offered rest, OWCA offered something rarer, purpose. Even now, as the digital clock on the wall crept closer to midnight, that purpose hadn't faded. His back ached more than it used to. His mustache wasn't as dark as it once had been, but his instincts remained sharp, his sense of responsibility even sharper. He looked across the room to the large whiteboard on the far wall, a holdover from the pre-digital toys. Carl had offered to replace it with a touchscreen years ago, but Monogram refused. There was something satisfying about dry erase markers squeaking across the board, about circling important updates and drawing little diagrams to explain complex missions. Right now it was nearly blank. Just one note scribbled in his own hand. Agent P, scheduled recon 0600, confirm with Carl. Even in the absence of crisis, there was always something to do, and he wouldn't have it any other way. As the hour grew late, he stood from his chair and stretched, his joints popping slightly. His uniform, once crisp and tight-fitting, had been loosened over the years for comfort. Still, he wore it every day, even when no meetings or visitors were scheduled. It was a quiet discipline, A silent message to himself. I still serve. And he did. Not because anyone expected it, but because this place, this strange, animal-run agency hidden beneath the mundane veneer of suburban life, had become home. The agents, the routines, the walls, the screens, it was all a part of him now. Not a burden, but a belonging. He reached for the small badge clipped to his desk, the original one. Worn around the edges, the photo faded, but still intact. He rarely wore it anymore. Digital clearance had replaced it years ago. But he kept it close, like an old photo of a friend. He turned it over in his hand. There it was again, that familiar face, younger, with a straighter back and brighter eyes. A man who had no idea how long he would last in command. A man who took his first steps into OWCA, wondering if he'd ever be more than a footnote. And now here he was. The footnote had become the chapter. Still standing. Monogram found himself walking through the quiet halls of OWCA more often than usual these days. It wasn't part of his job anymore, not officially at least, but old habits had their way of returning when the lights dimmed and the building slipped into silence. There was something about the stillness of the corridors that gave him clarity. Each hallway told a story, lined with doors he had walked through 1,000 times, with agents he'd briefed, supervised, and sometimes scolded. Some rooms were empty now, reassigned or restructured, yet the memories clung to them like faint echoes. He stopped by the old armory not because he needed equipment, but because the room itself reminded him of how far they'd come. It used to be chaotic, filled with gadgets only half-tested, and agents barely trained in their use. Now it was sleek and efficient, the shelves neatly organized, the tools quietly humming in their secure cases. A part of him missed the chaos, the way things used to malfunction, just enough to make every mission unpredictable. There was a charm in that, in knowing that everything didn't have to be perfect for things to turn out all right. That philosophy, he realized, had become a personal motto one he'd learned the hard way. Not everything had to be perfect. He didn't have to be perfect. All he needed to be was present, available, a constant. And that's what he had become, a constant. In the rapidly shifting landscape of agents and missions, he was the one who remained, the anchor. He continued his slow walk past the training hall, stopping briefly at the window looking into the gymnasium. There, even at this hour, a few newer recruits were sparring. He didn't know all their names, not like he once would have, but it didn't bother him. Their energy was the same, their drive unmistakable. He could see bits of himself in them, though they didn't know it. And maybe they never would. Maybe to them he was just the older man in the suit with the commanding voice and the tired eyes. That was okay. He didn't need recognition. What he needed was to ensure the mission continued, that the work didn't stop just because the faces did. As he turned to walk back to his office, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Sir? You're still up?" Carl. Of course it was Carl. He had a sixth sense when it came to Monogram's late-night wandering. Monogram smiled, folding his hands behind his back. "Could say the same about you." Carl approached, holding 2 paper cups of coffee, one in each hand. "Thought you might want one. Light cream, no sugar, unless your taste has changed in the past decade." Monogram took the cup with a grateful nod. Still the same. They stood in silence for a moment, sipping their coffee under the soft buzz of the hallway lights. Carl, like always, filled the quiet with just enough comfort. He didn't try to cheer Monogram up, didn't ask if something was wrong. He simply was there, a presence, like Monogram had been for so many. "You know," Carl said eventually, "people keep asking when you're going to step down." Rumors fly around faster than Agent P on a hoverboard. Monogram let out a low chuckle. Let them fly. Carl grinned. Good. I told them not to hold their breath. Monogram turned to face the wall, eyes settling on an old mission photo framed and hanging just outside the gym. It was from a summer years ago, the kind where everything felt new and electric. The photo showed him and several agents, all smiling, standing behind a confiscated Inotor that had accidentally turned the office printer into a sentient poetry-writing machine. He hadn't thought about that mission in years. Carl noticed the direction of his gaze. That was the summer we ran out of sticky notes because the printer was using them to write love letters. Monogram nodded, the smile tugging at his mustache, and the copy toner became currency for a day. Agent F still asks about that sometimes. Of course she does. For a few more moments, the past was real again, alive in memory. Not bittersweet, not aching, just there. A thread still tethered to the present. Carl eventually broke the silence. You ever think about writing it all down? Stories, I mean. You got enough for a dozen books. Monogram shook his head. If I wrote it all down, no one would believe it. That's half the fun. The older man considered it. A memoir, perhaps. Not for fame, and not even for history. But for the agents. The future ones who might need to know that behind the suit and mustache was a man who cared deeply, who stumbled, learned, failed, led, and stayed. Maybe someday, he said softly. Then after a pause, he added, but not while I'm still needed here. Carl didn't say anything. He just smiled, nodded, and took another sip of coffee. It was the kind of understanding built only through years of trust. As they turned and walked back toward the heart of OWCA, their footsteps echoed down the hall. Not lonely, not tired, but resolute. Still standing, still serving, still his post. The sun filtered gently through the blinds of Monogram's office. It was too early for most, but he was already seated behind his desk, files open, a mug of coffee half drunk beside him. Outside, OWCA was beginning to stir, its agents arriving one by one, unaware that their commander had been there since before dawn. He wasn't working exactly. Not anymore in the traditional sense. The major decisions had been handed off. There were committees now, oversight boards, and deputy directors managing the fieldwork. But there was a comfort in being there, a rhythm in sorting through reports, even if he wasn't required to respond to them. A knock came at the door. He glanced up. Come in. The door opened, and a young agent stepped inside, green badge, protocol handbook in hand, nervous expression on their face. Major Monogram, sir? Yes? I was told you'd be the person to talk to, about direction. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down. The agent did so, clearly unsure of what to expect. I just started last week. My handler said that before we're assigned officially, we should meet the old guard, learn from them. She said, you're still the best example we have. Monogram's brow lifted, a compliment wrapped in a formality. He allowed himself a modest nod. What is it you want to ask? The agent fumbled slightly. I guess, how do you do this for so long? I mean, fighting the same battles, making decisions that don't always have clear outcomes. Doesn't it wear you down? The question was honest. Not disrespectful, just wide-eyed and real. Monogram leaned back in his chair, folding his arms thoughtfully. Yes, it does wear you down. The young agent blinked. Oh. But, Monogram continued, that's part of the reason you do it. Because if you care enough to feel worn down, then you're in the right place. The moment you stop feeling it, the weight, the consequence, that's when you need to reevaluate. The agent slowly nodded. And when it gets hard? He chuckled softly. It always gets hard. But you're never alone in that. There's a team, support, people who get it. He paused, glancing toward a photograph tucked at the corner of his desk, one he rarely looked at but never removed. It showed him, Carl, Perry, and a few other senior agents, all standing under the OWCA banner after a particularly complicated mission. Dusty, smiling, tired but proud. You'll find your place, he added. It just might take a while. The agent rose to leave, reassured, and thanked him. Monogram watched the door close and leaned back once more, a long breath leaving his lungs. How many of those conversations had he had over the years? Dozens? Hundreds? He didn't mind repeating the same words. Sometimes the right message needed to be said over and over until it stuck, until it shaped someone's course. That had always been the job beneath the job. More than strategy or operations, it was people, shaping agents into more than tools, into leaders. The office began to hum with more life. Distant voices, elevator doors, printers churning. Monograms stood, moving to the window. He looked down at the open courtyard where a group of interns were practicing evasive maneuvers with an inflatable Platypus drone. He smiled. They'd be okay. He would fade eventually. All things did. But the seeds had been planted, the stories, the ethics, the example. OWCA didn't need to rely on one man forever. And that was the greatest success of all. It could survive without him. Still, he would remain, as long as he could, as long as he was able. Not to command, not even to advise, but to witness, to stand at his post and see it all go on. And if the day came when he finally turned in his badge, when he locked his office door for the last time and walked out into the sunset, he'd do it with no regrets. He had given everything he had, and it had mattered. He returned to his desk, took one last sip of coffee, and opened a fresh report. Outside, the day unfolded bright, loud, chaotic, full of possibility. Inside, Major Monogram stood his post. Still proud, still steady, still standing. And so, as the quiet hours of the night roll in, we leave behind the life of a man who never stopped standing at his post. Major Monogram, the voice of duty, the heart behind command, and the man who gave everything for a world that may never fully understand his sacrifice. In a world of secret agents and silly inventions, he was the steady hand, the constant. Not flashy, not loud, but always there. Now the office grows still. The reports are filed, and the city sleeps. And somewhere, perhaps under a dim lamp or a star-streaked sky, he sits not as a commander, not as a legend, but simply as a man who did his best. Sleep well, Commander Monogram. And to you watching, may your night be calm, your dreams be kind, and your heart stay steady just like his. Good night.